Food preservation is vitally important to people 250 years ago, and we've talked about multiple ways to preserve food. Things like ship's biscuits, pemmican, dried beef, even candy. But one thing we haven't covered in depth is portable soup. Portable soup was very common in the 18th century. It shows up in a lot of cookbooks. Probably more than half of the English cookbooks in the 18th century have a recipe for portable soup and multiple different kinds of recipes for portable soup. It ends up being used by soldiers and sailors, explorers, and regular travelers. So what is portable soup? It is meat broth condensed down to a solid form. This isn't necessarily easy to do, but they did it a lot in the 18th century because there were times when you would have excess sources of meat. You wanted to carry that into the future, and to preserve that flavor and that nutrition, as it were, you would condense this broth down into a way that you could store just about anywhere. It's fairly light, it takes up little space, and it will store for a great period of time. This is fairly easy to reconstitute. You would just put this into very warm water, possibly, lightly boiling water, and it will slowly dissolve and turn into a nice broth. This turned out to be a vitally important provision for the surgeons on board ship, but also used by all sorts of travelers. And there were just times when you didn't have access to food. And even though there isn't a ton of nutrition here, after all, it's a very small package, it is enough to keep you going. This wasn't used as just a standalone broth, but a base for other kinds of more complex soups, or you could use it in combination with pounded up ship's biscuits or other kind of powdered food to really bulk it up. Researching the origins of portable soup can be a little tricky. The first reference we have to portable soup, and it goes by many different names, that I could find is 1727, and we have a very, very complex and long recipe for this. I think that's probably the origins of it. It might be a little earlier than that, but it is very early 18th century. But by the time we get into the 1750s, the recipes are popping up all over the place. And in about 1755, 1756, it is adopted by the British Navy as a standard provision for ship's surgeons. And a ship would be issued so many pounds of portable soup for the number of men on board. The ship's surgeon would use this for particular kinds of illnesses where the men needed a low diet to recover properly. They needed something that was extremely easy to digest. Portable soup seems to go by about a dozen names in the 18th century. You'll find portable soup or pocket soup, veal glue, solid soup, solid broth, portmanteau pottage, just all kinds of names. One of the most famous references we have to portable soup is the portable soup that's taken along by Lewis and Clark on their expedition out west. They contracted for 200 pounds of portable soup. They were supplied with 193 pounds, and it cost them about $300. And they packaged it up in little tin boxes and took it along, and they used that in the sort of last resort situations. If they couldn't get any other food, they could make some portable soup. It would be a very, very meager meal if you were surviving on nothing but portable soup. But again, for medical situations and for survival situations, if this is what you've got, you will live. It becomes very popular in the late 18th century, and you'll find recipes for it all the way up until the turn of the 20th century. It's still being used then, even though there are probably industrial sort of substitutes for it so that people no longer need to make it themselves. Portable soup is being made in mass quantities by portable soup makers in the middle of the 18th century for the Navy and for other kinds of travelers. They would make this in big slabs, and if it was for the Navy, it'd be marked with a big broad arrow so that you knew it was Navy property. Most people were probably buying it in smaller puck sizes so that you could use that. You would have basically one serving per little chunk here, and you wouldn't have to deal with a giant slab. It's being made made by not only these mass producers, but also in individual kitchens. That's why we have so many recipes for portable soup in just regular cookbooks. And I think that points to something else about the use of portable soup. We think about it being used by sailors and possibly soldiers, explorers, and people traveling, but if that was the only use for portable soup, we wouldn't see recipes for it in cookbooks. It shows up in cookbook after cookbook of the 18th century, and not every recipe is the same. So many other recipes, they'll make one and basically copy it in every other cookbook. It never changes because it's easy to do. But they're trying to figure out the best way to make portable soup, and so each one of these recipes is a little bit different. So the real challenge is, how do we get from a giant pile of meat to a little tiny puck of portable soup? And I could read to you one of the recipes in the 18th century, but it would take like a half hour because every single recipe is long and complicated, even though this recipe really only has 2 ingredients and it's all technique. The complexity comes from the idea that we can't just boil this until we get to this stage. We have to remove particular components of the broth, and then we can reduce it down. And once it's reduced it down, we can't just keep boiling it or it will burn. And the other problem in the 18th century was the idea that they didn't have the same kind of cooking equipment we have today. Today, if you're going to do this, you will do it with a slow cooker. I promise you, you won't want to do it like the way we are going to do it, which is over an open fire. Now, those industrial manufacturers in the 18th century, they had tricks of the trade. They had large brick ovens, basically, or a stove, which would have a fire in the bottom and then a large cook pot in the top, so that they could slowly heat that from the bottom and continue to stir it, and they would be watching that all the time. And in the 18th century, this is one where it will take hours and hours to make portable soup, and you do have to watch it in the 18th century context or it'll burn. Today, in our slow cooker, we can walk away and come back a couple hours later and keep watching it. It's much easier. We need a large cooking vessel. Again, you will use a slow cooker. I'm going to be cooking in our standard cook pot of the 18th century here, a cook kettle made of tin, and we're going to use a particular cut of meat. I would suggest looking for shank cuts, and these are leg cuts of beef cows. These are generally very inexpensive. It's a difficult cut of meat to cook with. It is hard to get it tender enough. You have to cook it very low and slow, which is exactly what this recipe does. They usually have a large bone segment, which in normal cases would be a bad thing. But for this recipe, it's perfect. We want lots of bone, lots of connective tissue, cartilage, ligaments, tendons. That's what we want in our recipe, which normally we would not want in a cut of beef. So that's why it's a good thing about this particular recipe. They would use it because it used the cheapest cuts of meat. You can also use neck, which something like you would see a lot of the recipes talking about using sheep neck for portable soup. And we also end up using, in some of the recipes, they talking about using feet, the actual all the way down to the bottom. They would put that in the pot too. It has a lot of gelatin or collagen in it, and that's what we want for our portable soup. We're going to take our meat pieces, put them in our cooking vessel, and then pour water over them till it's just over the top. We don't want any of the meat sticking out above that. You might be thinking, maybe we should add some spice at this stage. Put some spice in there and it kind of, boil in with it and bring some flavor in with it. Well, some of the recipes do that, but there are other specific recipes that say not to do that, because the spicing is something you can't get rid of. So if your final product has spices that you don't want in your soup, there's nothing you can do about it. Whereas if you make it a simple just meat broth, then you can add spices to it when you're preparing the dish. So we've had our meat cooking here in our pot, and you do want to make sure it's covered in this first stage, cooking for at least 6 hours 8, 10, even up to 20 hours on low will work for this. We're basically cooking this down, breaking down as much of the meat as possible and extracting some of that collagen from the bones and other connective tissue. And what we've got now, it truly smells just heavenly. It's a wonderful beef soup that we've got. I mean, we could put vegetables in here and it would be great. What we're going to do now is to separate the solids from the liquids. And in some circumstances in the 18th century, they would have, say, if you were a portable soup maker, you would just basically start a new batch and you would put the bones and the meat into a brand new batch with some new meat and new water and just start another batch, and then you'd keep going with this. So let's talk about this meat for just a second. We don't throw this out. This is perfect meat for making potted beef, and the recipes from the 18th century talk about this. You take this beef, take out any of the little fatty bits that are still there. Most of it's already broken down and turned into an oil, but there's some of that. We want to take the meat portions and then we pack it into a jar. This already will break up, just kind of shred it up, and then we pour clarified butter over the top. You can set this in the oven for 20 minutes at, say, 250 degrees. That will sterilize everything. And then you've got this potted beef that's good for 30 days, 60 days. It's exactly what they would use in the 18th century. They would take that potted beef out whenever they wanted to and spread it on toast. And it's just so very good. And so don't waste this. This is some of the best part. Here's our meat broth portion of it. We're gonna let this cool and the fat will rise to the top. And we want to remove all the fat. Now, in the 18th century, they would probably just scoop this off. Of course, in a modern context, we have other tools that will more easily drain the broth from the bottom. It doesn't matter how you get it done, but you want to extract all the oils off the top. If you let it get cold enough, it might even solidify. You can just peel it off, but we do want no fat in our finished broth. Once you've got the oils taken off, we need this to be a totally clear broth, so we're going to go ahead and strain this through a cloth. It's already been through the colander, we've got the solids out, but we want those little bits out too, so it's completely clear. Now that we've got our clear broth, it's time to reduce it again. We've let this cool off. Now we're going to heat it back up, but we have to be very careful about the temperature that we heat it up here. We're going to put it on as low a heat as we possibly can. We want to have a vessel here without a lid on it so that the vapor can go away, and it's going to reduce for, I mean, you're going to need to bring it down to 1/3 of what you've got now, or even more than that. And this might take a while. It really depends on how big our batch is. This will probably take 2 or 3 hours easily to get down to a lower level than this. So I've reduced this down. I spent something like 8 hours on this batch. It's very difficult to do over an open fire. This is so much easier to do in a slow cooker, so definitely go ahead and do that. You really don't have to quite go this far. If there's enough collagen in that meat, then if you let it cool, you will be able to tell. It'll form a skin and almost like it'll be a brown jello, basically. You can reduce it a little bit further than that, but it gets harder and harder to keep it from burning. So you can basically stop at that point. Let it get cool. If you set your vessel aside and it's still very liquidy, go ahead, put it back on low heat and reduce it some more. But once you get it to this point, then you need to do the rest of it basically at room temperature or extremely low temperatures. And what we're trying to do is just drive out the final bit of moisture. In the time period, they talk about taking this out and maybe putting it in little cups, and it'll start to form a skin and you can let it dry that way, or you can put it out onto flannel. And the flannel they're talking about is woolen flannel cloth. And obviously it needs to have, at this point, to form some kind of a skin. You wouldn't, obviously from the directions, you wouldn't want it to flow into the cloth at all. So it has to have enough skin that it'll stay on top of that. We want to have air going all the way around it if possible. So they would set this out in the sun, not in a hot sun, but in a dry, kind of probably a winter sun situation. And it will go from this to this final form that we've got, and it might take a couple weeks to get there. Now we can speed this up in a modern sense by using a dehydrator that you can set to a very low temperature. If you can't set your dehydrator to, say, less than 120 degrees, it probably won't work. But if you can set it down to, say, 110 degrees, it will start to dry it out pretty rapidly, and it'll be done in a day or two. So in its final state, after, say, a week of drying, it should be pretty hard. If you squeeze these, it's kind of cool in here, it's probably 65 degrees. If you squeeze these, you can just feel the gooey center. So they're not completely dry. Here's our portable soup from 13 years ago, our original episode, and it's undoubtedly still good, all except this one piece. It has a little bit of white, sort of a dusting on it, and some of the recipes in the 18th century talk about it getting a little maybe mold or something like that on the outside. I'm not sure if it's mold or whether it's salt that is sort of come out to the exterior surface, but in the 18th century they talked about just wiping that off and using it, and they said the flavor didn't penetrate to the inside. I think today if your portable soup gets moldy, probably go ahead and throw it out. And that's why we don't store it in a totally airtight container. This is probably gonna still try to get rid of some moisture, so we usually wrap it in a little bit of paper and put it in a tin that still can breathe a little bit. I think if you sealed it up in a jar, you might have that moisture getting in there and maybe some mold or something forming on the outside. So here's our broth reconstituted, and I'm gonna try this without any seasoning, without anything added to it, so we can get a full understanding about what this tastes like all by itself. So here we go. Well, I would definitely spice it up. It's not salty at all. I was kind of worried that, condensing it way down like that, it would be very, very salty, but it's just a simple, clear broth. It's got a nice meaty flavor to it, and it would definitely be a great base for some other kind of soup. And maybe I added a little more water than I should have for that particular puck, because it's fairly diluted, but you can definitely see, that it's got a lot of body to it and probably a decent amount of nutrition. That said, if this is all you've got, you definitely are going to survive on this some amount of time. It won't last you for forever. After all, it's just a tiny little piece of food, but it would certainly keep you going.